Somewhere along the way, most of us learned what "turn the other cheek" means. Someone wrongs you, you let it go. Someone hits you, you don't hit back. It's become shorthand in Christian culture for enduring mistreatment quietly, almost a synonym for meekness itself. People say it to comfort a friend after an insult, or to talk themselves into staying silent when they've been hurt. It's a reasonable way to read the words. Jesus does say, do not resist an evil person. He does say to offer the other cheek. On the surface, passivity looks like exactly what's being asked for. But look closer at the sentence, and a strange detail is sitting in plain sight. One almost nobody stops to ask about. Jesus doesn't just say cheek. He says the right cheek, specifically. And in a face-to-face encounter, that single word changes what kind of blow we're actually picturing. It's a small detail, but it's the kind of detail that, once you see it, makes you wonder what else got smoothed over somewhere between a first-century Roman courtroom and a modern Sunday morning. That's where this video begins. The place to start isn't a courtroom, though. It's a hillside, sometime in the late 20s AD, along the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. Galilee at this point in history is not an independent country. It hasn't been for generations. It sits inside a province governed on Rome's behalf, administered locally, taxed constantly, kept in line by soldiers who answer to Caesar, not to any Jewish authority. The people gathered on that hillside listening to Jesus know this in their bones. Occupation isn't a historical concept to them. It's Tuesday. Under that occupation, the Jewish community still runs its own legal and religious life. Synagogues, local courts, rabbis, scribes, Pharisees, debating fine points of Torah in the shade. But all of it operates inside boundaries Rome allows. Roman power can override Jewish authority whenever it wants to. And Roman soldiers, stationed in and marching through Jewish towns, carry a specific legal privilege that almost everyone in that crowd has either felt personally or watched happen to a neighbor: the right to conscript a local into carrying their gear for exactly 1 mile, not 2, 1. It's written into how the empire moves its army. Locally, Galilee answers to Herod Antipas, a tetrarch who owes his position entirely to Rome's approval, and knows it. He is not a distant emperor ruling from across the sea. He is close, visible, a Jewish ruler governing at the pleasure of a power he cannot refuse himself. That layered arrangement, a local ruler answerable to a distant empire, shapes almost every relationship in the region. Justice, taxation, land, labor, all of it runs through a chain of authority that ultimately terminates somewhere in Rome, not in Jerusalem. And everyone on that hillside knows exactly how little say they have in where that chain leads. This is the daily texture of the world Jesus is speaking into, a world where a Roman soldier can stop you on the road and put his pack on your shoulders, where a Jewish creditor can drag a poor man into court over an unpaid debt, where being struck in public isn't just physical pain, it's a public statement about who holds power and who doesn't. And into that world, Jesus starts talking about an old law. Centuries earlier, when Israel was still shaping its legal identity in the wilderness, the Torah had laid down a principle meant to limit violence, not encourage it. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. It sounds harsh to modern ears, but in its own time, it was a restraint, a boundary that said punishment could not exceed the harm done. No blood feuds, no escalating revenge. Just proportion, capped. Israel wasn't alone in having a law like this. Other ancient Near Eastern legal codes from the same broader world contained similar proportional injury principles, which tells us this kind of law was a recognized way of managing violence and disputes across the region, not a uniquely harsh invention. What made Israel's version distinct was less its severity and more its context, embedded in a covenant relationship with God, rather than issued purely as royal decree. By the 1st century, in the hands of ordinary people, that boundary had often drifted into something closer to personal license, a justification for getting even, dressed up as justice. Jesus doesn't throw the law out. He never says he's come to Just moments earlier in this same sermon, he's told the crowd plainly that he hasn't come to abolish what came before, but to complete it. What he does next is something more precise. He takes that old boundary on retaliation and turns it directly toward the pressure points his listeners are actually living under: a slap, a debt, a soldier's demand. 3 ordinary indignities, 3 moments familiar to almost everyone sitting on that hill. He's about to tell them what to do with each one. He starts with the most physically confrontational example he could choose. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Look at the wording carefully. He doesn't just say cheek. He says the right cheek. That's an oddly specific detail for an example that's supposed to cover a general situation. Think about the physical mechanics for a second. If someone is standing directly in front of you and strikes your right cheek, using their right hand, the socially expected hand for this kind of confrontation in that culture, the natural motion isn't a punch. It's a backhand. And a backhand strike, in that world, wasn't how 2 equals settled a dispute. 2 equals fought with fists, face to face, as an even contest. A backhand was something else. It was the strike of a social superior toward an inferior, a master toward a servant, a Roman toward a subject, a husband toward a wife, in the eyes of that culture's own hierarchy. It carried less to do with causing damage and more to do with publicly declaring, "You are beneath me, and I have the right to remind you of it." This reading, developed most fully by scholars like Walter Wink, rests on a historical inference rather than something the text states outright. The gospel doesn't stop to explain the mechanics of the blow, but the specificity of right cheek, paired with what we know of how blows were delivered and understood in that culture, makes the inference a reasonable one, even if it isn't the only possible reading. What the text does make clear, without any inference required, is that this is a scene of humiliation, not a schoolyard fight between equals. Later Jewish legal tradition, written down in the Mishnah roughly a century and a half after Jesus, but reflecting older custom, actually assigned a backhanded slap a heavier compensation than an ordinary blow, treating it as a distinct, more insulting category of offense than a regular strike. That's a later source, and it can't simply be read backward into the 1st century as proof of what everyone thought at the time of Jesus. But it does confirm something worth noting. This culture did not treat every kind of physical blow the same way. A slap carried social meaning a punch didn't, and the direction and hand mattered to how insulting it was judged to be. So this isn't a random act of violence Jesus is describing. It's a very specific kind of insult, not a fight between equals. A reminder of who holds power over whom. That changes the entire question he's actually answering. It's no longer, what do you do when someone hits you? It's something far more pointed than that. So what does Jesus tell the humiliated person to do? On the surface, it sounds like total surrender. Do not resist the one who is evil. For centuries, that's how it's been read. Don't push back. Don't fight. Don't respond at all. But the Greek word behind resist here, antisteni, carries more weight than a simple don't react. In other New Testament contexts, it's used for standing against something in a forceful, sometimes militarily or violently oppositional sense, the kind of resistance you'd use in a standoff, not the kind you'd use in an ordinary disagreement. Some scholars argue this narrows what Jesus is actually forbidding, not never respond to injustice in any way, but something closer to don't meet violence with violence. Don't escalate the confrontation into the kind of fight your aggressor expects. This is a genuinely debated reading. Not every Greek specialist presses the word this far, and it would be an overstatement to call it settled. But even taken cautiously, it opens a door that a flat, offer no response of any kind reading closes shut. Because don't escalate into violence and offer no response of any kind are simply not the same instruction. And what Jesus tells the humiliated person to do next isn't silence, it's an action. Turn the other cheek. Consider what that actually does, physically. If the first strike was a backhand, the blow of a superior to an inferior, a backhand to the other cheek isn't even possible without the striker switching hands or closing his fist, which means the person delivering the blow now faces a choice: either stop or hit this person again, but this time as an equal would, face to face, fist closed. The person who was struck has done something remarkable with almost no visible effort at all. Not fought back, not run away. They've simply refused to let the insult end where the striker intended it to end. They've forced the one delivering the blow to either back down or, in striking again, unintentionally acknowledge them as an equal worth fighting rather than a subordinate worth backhanding. Jesus doesn't stop there. His second example moves from a public street encounter into a much more specific and formal setting, a courtroom. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. This is debt language, and it assumes a specific legal scenario his listeners would have recognized instantly. Under Jewish law, a poor man could be taken to court by a creditor and legally required to hand over his tunic, his inner garment, as collateral against what he owed. But the cloak, the outer garment, was protected by name. Exodus is explicit about it. Even if a creditor takes a man's cloak as security for a debt, he has to return it before nightfall, because for a poor man, that cloak might double as his only blanket. It was, in effect, the one possession the law refused to let anyone take from him permanently, no matter how much he owed. So when Jesus tells someone standing in that courtroom to give the cloak as well, he's telling them to voluntarily hand over the single item the entire legal system had been specifically constructed to protect. Which means, if the person actually does this, they leave that courtroom with nothing at all. And in a culture without private changing rooms or discreet exits, that nakedness wouldn't be a private embarrassment. It would be visible, public, immediate. Here's the detail worth slowing down for. In the honor-shame framework of the ancient Near East, exposing someone's nakedness didn't just shame the person exposed, it reflected back onto whoever caused the exposure. Genesis carries this instinct all the way back to Noah, when he's found uncovered in his tent. The narrative doesn't dwell on his shame so much as on his son's failure to look away and cover him, which becomes the act treated as disgraceful. The shame of exposure, in that moral world, has a way of landing on whoever allowed it or caused it, not only on the one exposed. So picture the scene again. A poor debtor, having already given up everything the law required of him, hands over the one thing the law was protecting, and walks out with nothing left to give. But the shame in that room doesn't necessarily stay where the creditor expected it to land. It isn't only the debtor left holding the loss anymore, it's the man who pushed the demand that far, standing in a room that has just watched exactly how far he was willing to go. This wasn't a hypothetical abuse Jesus was inventing for the sake of a good illustration either. The prophet Amos, centuries earlier, condemns exactly this kind of behavior. Creditors who took a poor man's cloak in pledge and then, instead of returning it as the law required, kept it and lay down beside the altar on garments taken from people who could least afford to lose them. The law protecting the cloak existed precisely because people kept finding ways around it. Jesus's listeners weren't hearing an abstract legal footnote. They were hearing a scenario some of them, or their parents, or their neighbors, had lived through personally. That's what makes the instruction land as hard as it does. Jesus isn't asking someone to give up a minor inconvenience. He's asking them to hand over the one possession generations of prophets had specifically fought to protect, and to do it voluntarily, before anyone could take it from them by force. The third example moves the scene again, off the street, out of the courtroom, and onto a Roman road. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. That word, forces, is doing real historical work here, not metaphorical work. Roman law gave soldiers stationed in occupied territory the legal right to conscript a civilian into carrying their equipment, but only for 1 mile. This wasn't a vague cultural grievance. It was a specific, documented military regulation, part of the administrative system Rome used to move its army through provinces like Judea and Galilee without paying for local labor. For Jesus' listeners, this wasn't hypothetical. A Roman soldier stopping a Jewish villager on the road and loading 60 or 70 pounds of pack gear onto his shoulders was an ordinary, resented feature of daily life under occupation. 1 mile, and not a step further. That limit existed because Rome understood that forced labor, left unchecked, breeds the kind of resentment that eventually turns into rebellion. Even an empire manages how much resentment it can afford to generate. So Jesus tells his listeners, when that soldier's legal mile runs out, keep walking. Think about what that does to the moment. The soldier's authority over this person had a hard legal boundary. 1 mile, then it ends, by Rome's own rule. Walking a second mile isn't obedience to that authority anymore. It's stepping past it entirely, voluntarily, into territory the soldier has no legal claim to whatsoever. The conscripted laborer, for 1 extra mile, becomes someone freely giving a gift he was never required to give, to the very man who had no right to ask for anything further from him. There's a detail worth flagging here, because it resurfaces later in a way that's easy to miss. The Greek word behind forces in this teaching, the word for that specific Roman rite of conscription, shows up again in Matthew's Gospel, in a very different scene. When Jesus is led out to be crucified, unable to carry the crossbeam any further himself, Matthew records that the soldiers compelled a passerby named Simon of Cyrene to carry it for him. It's the same word, the same Roman legal mechanism Jesus once told a crowd to voluntarily exceed, is the very mechanism used on his own execution day to force someone else to carry his burden. The teacher who told his listeners to walk a second mile for a Roman soldier ends up, on the road to his death, needing someone else to carry his load for the first one. 3 scenes, a street, a courtroom, a road, 3 completely different systems of power, social, legal, and military, and in every single one, Jesus isn't telling people to absorb the blow and disappear quietly into it. He's giving them something to do with it. If you're starting to notice a pattern here, a backhand that forces a choice, a cloak that reverses whose shame is showing, a mile that turns forced labor into an unrequested gift, that isn't an accident of reading closely. That's what's actually sitting inside a verse most of us learn to read as, just take it. If this is the first time you're seeing turn the other cheek this way, it's worth sitting with for a moment before we keep going. This is exactly the kind of layer this channel exists to dig up, the world underneath the familiar reading. If that's useful to you, subscribing helps more of these find you, and if one of these details caught you off guard, I'd genuinely like to know which one in the comments. Because there's still a question we haven't touched. Jesus taught this. But did he ever actually live it? Go back to the cloak. Jesus told a crowd on a hillside, if someone takes your tunic, give your cloak as well. Give up everything the law was protecting, walk away with nothing, and let the shame of it fall where it actually belongs. This is 911. It's a striking teaching, but teachings are easy to give from a hillside. Now follow him forward, past the sermon, past the healings, past the last meal with his closest followers, to a Roman execution site outside the walls of Jerusalem. Matthew records what happens to Jesus' own clothing in that moment, almost as a passing detail buried inside a much larger scene, soldiers dividing his garments among themselves, casting lots for what he had been wearing, his tunic, his cloak. Taken, not offered, taken, by force, by exactly the kind of imperial authority the second mile teaching had been written to address in the first place. He is stripped completely, publicly, left with nothing, in about as literal a fulfillment as could be imagined of the exact hypothetical courtroom scenario he had once described on that hillside years earlier. And centuries before either the sermon or the cross, the prophet Isaiah had already described a suffering figure who does not shield himself from this kind of treatment. I gave my back to those who strike, and my cheeks to those who pull out the beard. I hid not my face from disgrace and spitting. A servant who absorbs humiliation without retaliating in kind, not because he lacks any power to resist, but because something larger than his own comfort is being accomplished through that restraint. Whether this figure in Isaiah points forward specifically to Jesus or describes a broader pattern of faithful suffering that Jesus' own life later echoes and fulfills, is itself a significant question within Old Testament scholarship, one this video isn't attempting to fully settle. But the early church, from its earliest writings onward, consistently read this passage as illuminating exactly what happened to Jesus, and the verbal echoes between the two texts are difficult to treat as coincidental. Put these three moments side by side and let them sit there for a second. A hillside teaching about a cheek, a cloak, and a mile. A servant in Isaiah who takes exactly that kind of treatment, centuries before either the sermon or the cross. A cross where Jesus is struck, stripped, and forced along a road he did not choose. This is not a case of Jesus handing his followers an ethic he never had to live by himself. The pattern he taught on that hillside is close to identical to the pattern he walks, almost detail for detail, on the way to his own death, the backhand at his trial, the garments divided at the cross, the forced march toward Golgotha under the authority of the very empire whose 1-mile law he had once told his followers to voluntarily walk past. He is not asking anyone to carry something he refused to carry first. And that reframes almost everything this video has uncovered so far. This was never a teaching about disappearing quietly under mistreatment. It was, among other things, a description in advance of exactly what strength without retaliation would cost, spoken by someone who would go on to pay that cost personally, in full, within the same lifetime as the people who first heard him say it. A hillside, a crowd sitting in the dust, listening to a rabbi say something they had likely never heard phrased quite this way before. A street, somewhere in Galilee, where a hand rises to strike, not to fight, but to remind someone of their place. A courtroom where a poor man has nothing left to give and gives it anyway. A road under a soldier's boot where one required mile becomes two freely chosen ones. And then, years later, a hill outside Jerusalem. A different crowd. A different kind of striking. Garments divided by lot. A tunic. A cloak. A road walked under the weight of a beam instead of a pack. The teacher becomes the text. Not resist and disappear. Resist, in the sense of refusing to become the very thing that struck you. Not silence for its own sake. Strength that answers cruelty without borrowing cruelty's own methods. The cheek, the cloak, the mile. 3 ordinary humiliations, quietly and deliberately turned into 3 small refusals to be defined entirely by someone else's violence. And the man who taught it did not ask his followers to carry anything he was unwilling to carry first. Most people have never stood in a Roman courtroom or felt a soldier's hand settle a pack onto their shoulder. But almost everyone knows what it feels like to be made smaller by someone who had the power to do it and knew it. A voice that talks over yours in a room where you had no real say. A decision made about your life without anyone bothering to ask you. A moment where speaking up would cost you something and staying silent would cost you something else entirely. That's the tension this teaching was actually written for. Not abstract patience for its own sake. The specific, familiar ache of being treated as less by someone who could get away with it, and probably knew that too. What's quietly remarkable, reading it again now, is that Jesus never tells the person in that position to become invisible. He tells them to do something, small, deliberate, unmistakably theirs, the kind of response that doesn't ask the aggressor's permission first. There's something worth sitting with in that. Not a formula for every hard relationship, and certainly not a blanket instruction for every unsafe situation. The text doesn't claim to answer all of that on its own, and it shouldn't be stretched to try. But a picture, at least, of what it might look like to hold on to your own dignity in a moment of mistreatment without needing to become a mirror image of the cruelty aimed at you. Jesus didn't teach this from a safe distance. He was struck on the cheek, stripped of his cloak, made to walk a road under force he hadn't chosen. And in each of those moments, Something in him remained unmoved by the hand that was trying to move him. Maybe that's the piece of this story closest to home. Not the Roman courtroom, not the dusty provincial road, but the quiet, ordinary moments when someone tries to tell you, through how they treat you, exactly who you're allowed to be. And the possibility, sitting inside this old and often misunderstood teaching, that you don't have to accept their definition of you in order to survive the moment. Jesus never asked anyone to disappear. He asked them to answer cruelty with something cruelty has no idea what to do with. If this changed how you read a verse you thought you already understood, that's exactly why this channel exists, to go back to the text and look again, slower, closer, with the history it was actually written into. If it was worth your time, consider subscribing to the Scripture Project, and if someone in your life needs to see this passage differently, send it their way.